The sound of a key turning in a lock echoes through history with different meanings. For some, it's the promise of safety. For others, it's the beginning of punishment. But in the winter of 1173, when that key turned for Eleanor, Duchess of Aquitaine and Queen of England, it marked something else entirely. The imprisonment of the most powerful woman in Europe by the only man who'd ever matched her ambition. This isn't a story about the crown she wore or the crusades she joined. It's not about the troubadours who sang her praises or the courts where she dispensed justice. No, this is the story of what happens when a brilliant political mind is caged within stone walls, when power is stripped away but influence remains, when love for one's children becomes an act of treason in the eyes of a paranoid king. For 16 years, Eleanor of Aquitaine vanished from the world stage, not dead. That would have been too simple, too clean. Instead, she was buried alive in a series of English fortresses, moved like a dangerous relic from castle to castle, her very existence a state secret. Her husband, King Henry II, believed he could erase her, transform the most dynamic woman in Christendom into a ghost haunting his kingdom's towers. He was wrong. What followed wasn't a dramatic escape or a daring rescue. It was something far more devastating to Henry's legacy. A 16-year masterclass in patient revenge, played through whispered alliances and secret letters, through sons who remembered their mother's touch, and vassals who never forgot their true Duchess. While Henry aged and raged, fighting shadows of his own making, Eleanor waited and plotted and remembered every slight, every betrayal, every year stolen from her life. This is a tale of psychological warfare waged from behind prison walls, of a queen who discovered that sometimes the most powerful position isn't on a throne, but in the hearts and minds of those who remember you. It's about the slow, crushing weight of confinement on a spirit that refused to break, and the terrible price of keeping a lioness in a cage. The French have a saying, "La vengeance est un plat qui se mange froid." Revenge is a dish best served cold. Eleanor of Aquitaine didn't just serve it cold, she let it age for 16 winters, fermenting in the stone cellars of her imprisonment, until it became something far more potent than mere revenge. It became legacy. So settle in for a story where the battlefield is a prison cell, where weapons are memories and patience, where victory isn't measured in conquered territories, but in the sons who rise to power and the husband who dies knowing he lost. If you're drawn to tales of resilience forged in solitude, of brilliant minds that turn captivity into strategy, consider subscribing to hear more stories of history's most fascinating survivors. Now, let us enter the glittering, treacherous world of the Angevin court, a gilded cage where marriage was warfare, children were chess pieces, and love was the most dangerous weapon of all. Eleanor of Aquitaine wasn't born to be anyone's wife. She was born to rule. At 15, she'd inherited the Duchy of Aquitaine, a territory that sprawled across southwestern France like a jewel-encrusted gauntlet thrown in the face of less fortunate monarchs. It was larger than the lands controlled by the King of France, wealthier too, more cultured, more sophisticated, more everything that mattered in the chess game of medieval power. The moment her father died, Eleanor didn't become France's most eligible bride. She became Europe's most dangerous unmarried woman. They married her off to Louis VII of France, of course. What else could they do with a 15-year-old girl who controlled more land than kings? But Eleanor brought more than vast estates and overflowing coffers to the French court. She brought the sun-soaked culture of the South, where troubadours sang of love as a noble art, and women were celebrated for their wit as much as their beauty. She brought a mind that saw politics not as a burden, but as the most thrilling game ever invented. Most dangerously, she brought the unshakable conviction that her birthright made her not just a queen consort, but a sovereign in her own right. The problem with Louis was that he'd rather be a monk than a king. Where Eleanor saw the Second Crusade as a chance to exercise power on the world stage, Louis saw it as a particularly violent pilgrimage. In 1147, when she announced she'd accompany him to the Holy Land, the court was scandalised. Queens didn't go on crusade. Queens certainly didn't summon their own vassals, organise their own contingent of Aquitanian knights, and sail for Outremer as an independent military commander. She traded the stale incense of the French court for the sharp scent of salt and hot dust, a perfume she found far more intoxicating. But Eleanor did, because Eleanor always did exactly what Eleanor wanted. The marriage unravelled in Antioch, in her Uncle Raymond's sun-drenched palace where the wine flowed sweet and the politics flowed sweeter. The strategic dispute was simple enough. Eleanor and Raymond wanted to recapture Edessa, the city whose fall had triggered the crusade. It was sound military thinking, the kind of clear-eyed strategy you'd expect from rulers who understood that holy wars were still wars. Louis wanted to pray in Jerusalem, that's all, the most powerful army in Christendom, and he wanted to use it as an armed pilgrimage tour. When Eleanor suggested their marriage should be annulled, they were cousins after all, and the church frowned on such things. She wasn't having a marital spat, she was making a political declaration. If Louis wouldn't treat her as an equal partner in power, she'd take her duchy and find someone who would. The horror in the chronicles wasn't really about the rumoured affair with her uncle. That was just the easiest way for small minds to explain why a woman would dare to have her own foreign policy. The real scandal was that a queen had looked at a king and found him wanting. She found Henry II of England to be an entirely different creature. Where Louis was pious, Henry was pragmatic. Where Louis was cautious, Henry was voracious. He was 18 years younger than Eleanor, built like a warrior, with hands that could snap a sword or sign a treaty with equal skill. He didn't want a decorative wife. He wanted an alliance that would give him half of France. Eleanor didn't want a protective husband. She wanted a partner who'd match her ambition conquest for conquest. For a while, it worked magnificently. They built an empire that stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees. They had 8 children who survived to adulthood, each one a potential dynasty, each one a weapon in the endless war of succession. Eleanor established her court at Poitiers, transforming it into the cultural capital of Europe, where the ideals of courtly love weren't just pretty songs, but a sophisticated code that placed women at the centre of civilization. But Henry had appetites that no one woman could satisfy. No matter how brilliant, the mistresses were expected. Kings collected women like they collected castles. What wasn't expected was Rosamund Clifford, Fair Rosamund, Rosa Mundi, the rose of the world who became Rosa Immundi, the unclean rose. In the acid wit of court chroniclers, Henry didn't just take a mistress, he built her a bower at Woodstock, a legendary labyrinth where he could hide his precious flower from the world, or more particularly, from his queen. He lavished her with gifts that should have been Eleanor's. He spoke to her with the tenderness he'd forgotten how to show his wife, most unforgivably. He treated her as if she mattered. The humiliation was public, calculated, and devastating. Eleanor had conquered kingdoms, led crusades, birthed dynasties, and here was her husband, mooning over a younger woman like a shepherd boy in one of those insipid pastoral poems. The ultimate insult wasn't the infidelity, it was the cliché. Eleanor, a woman who had debated strategy with Byzantine emperors, was being undone by a simple country romance. The court knew, the kingdom knew, Europe knew. The Queen of England had been replaced in her husband's heart by someone whose only achievement was possessing a pretty face and a willing disposition. But the Rosamund affair was merely the poison that revealed the deeper rot. The real conflict between Henry and Eleanor was about their sons. Henry had taken the unprecedented step of crowning their eldest boy, Henry, as co-king in 1170. The young king, they called him, a monarch in name who wasn't allowed to rule so much as a single village. It was Henry's way of securing the succession while keeping all the power for himself, giving his sons titles that were as empty as promises. Eleanor saw it differently. These weren't just Henry's sons. They were her sons. Richard, her golden boy, who'd been raised in her beloved Aquitaine and spoke her language of poetry and power. Geoffrey, clever and calculating, but who understood that politics was performance art. Even John, the youngest, who watched his older brothers with the hungry eyes of a wolf pup studying the pack. Henry wanted to keep them as decorative princes forever, beautiful puppets dancing on strings he controlled. Eleanor wanted them to be kings, real kings, the kind who ruled as she had taught them, with strength, culture, and the understanding that power wasn't given but taken. By 1173, the Angevin court had become a family at war with itself. Henry held all the power but trusted no one. Eleanor commanded loyalty but lacked freedom. Their sons circled like hungry hawks, eager for the feast of power their titles promised but their father denied. The empire they'd built together was cracking along the fault lines of their marriage. Something had to give. Someone had to act. Eleanor looked at her sons, Richard straining against his leash in Aquitaine, young Henry bitter with ceremonial emptiness, Geoffrey calculating odds with mathematical precision, and made a choice that would echo through centuries. If Henry wouldn't share power willingly, perhaps it was time to take it. The Great Revolt of 1173 began not with armies marching, but with a mother's whisper to her sons. Your father has forgotten that kingdoms aren't inherited. They're claimed. She established herself at Poitiers, and suddenly her court wasn't just about courtly love and troubadour songs. It became the beating heart of rebellion. From there, she orchestrated a revolution that would pull in the King of France, the Count of Flanders, the King of Scotland, and half the barons of England. This wasn't a family squabble. It was a coordinated assault on Henry's power from every direction. The chroniclers would later paint her as a vindictive wife, a jealous woman lashing out over her husband's infidelities. They missed the point entirely. Eleanor wasn't rebelling because Henry had taken a mistress. She was rebelling because he'd taken her power, her sons' futures, her ability to shape the world according to her will. Rosamond was just the insult added to injury, the public humiliation that made private negotiation impossible. For 18 months, Europe burned with the fires of civil war. Henry, that irrepressible force of nature, proved why he'd conquered half of France in the first place. He moved like lightning, crushing rebellions in Normandy, securing loyalty in England, splitting his enemies with bribes and threats. He was everywhere at once, that stocky frame appearing on battlefields from Scotland to Aquitaine, those clever hands signing treaties and death warrants with equal ease. Eleanor watched her rebellion crumble city by city, battle by battle. Her sons, for all their grievances, were no match for their father's ruthless efficiency. Young Henry discovered that wearing a crown meant nothing when your father controlled the treasury. Richard learned that all the military genius in the world couldn't overcome superior numbers and resources. Geoffrey found that clever plans meant nothing when your enemy moved faster than your messengers. The end came as Eleanor tried to flee to Paris, to the court of her first husband. How's that for irony? The woman who'd once scandalized Christendom by leaving Louis for Henry now sought Louis's protection from Henry. She dressed as a man, that proud queen pulling on rough wool and leather, hiding her famous beauty under a knight's helm. For a few days, she rode hard across the French countryside, tasting a freedom she hadn't felt in years. They caught her before she reached the border. Of course they did. Henry's men were everywhere, and a queen, even one dressed as a knight, moved with a retinue that was hard to hide. When they brought her before Henry, still in her man's clothing, the symbolism was perfect. Here was Eleanor of Aquitaine, who'd spent her life refusing to be contained by anyone's idea of what a woman should be, literally caught wearing the costume of the power she'd been denied. Henry looked at his captive queen, this woman who'd shared his bed, borne his children, helped build his empire, and then tried to tear it all down, and made a decision that would haunt the rest of his reign. He couldn't execute her. She was the Queen of England and Duchess of Aquitaine. He couldn't divorce her. That would mean releasing her lands and her influence. He couldn't trust her. She'd just proved that spectacularly. So he chose the cruelest option of all. He would make her disappear, not dead. That would make her a martyr, not exiled. That would make her a rallying point. Just gone. Locked away in a series of English castles, moved regularly so no one could mount a rescue, kept in comfort so no one could claim mistreatment, but absolutely, completely, utterly removed from the world of power she had inhabited for 50 years. The cage door closed on one of the most brilliant political minds of the age. But here's the thing about caging a lioness. It doesn't make her less dangerous, it just makes her more patient. And Eleanor of Aquitaine, as Henry would learn over the next 16 years, had patience enough to outlast empires. The first winter in captivity taught Eleanor something valuable. Stone walls aren't prisons. Time is. They started her at Chinon, that fortress perched above the Vienne River like a stone fist. Then Winchester, with its draughty halls and memories of better days. Eventually Old Sarum, that bleak Norman stronghold where the wind howled through arrow slits like the keening of ghosts. The locations changed, but the routine remained crushingly constant. Wake to grey stone, walk within grey stone, sleep surrounded by grey stone. The woman who'd once commanded the cultural heart of Europe now commanded 4 walls, and whatever view her current jailers permitted. Henry was clever about it. No dungeons for his queen. That would invite sympathy and rebellion. Instead, he gave her comfort without freedom, luxury without power. Fine clothes arrived regularly, rich furs for the winter, silk for summer. The food was fitting for royalty. Venison from the king's own forests, wine from French vineyards she'd once owned. She had ladies to attend her, though they were more spies than companions, reporting every word, every gesture, every visitor who never came. The pipe rolls, those meticulous records of royal expenses, tell the story in pounds and shillings. £25 here for the Queen's household, 10 marks there for her clothing, £5 for candles. Even her light was rationed, measured, controlled. She lived like a queen and existed like a ghost, maintained in style while being systematically erased from memory. The cruelest cut was the children. Henry made sure of that. No visits from Richard, her golden lion who ruled Aquitaine in her name but never saw her face. No word from Geoffrey, whose clever mind she'd shaped but could no longer counsel. Young John, barely in his teens when she disappeared, would grow to manhood knowing his mother only as a cautionary tale. Even her daughters, Matilda in Germany, Eleanor in Castile, Joanna in Sicily, were forbidden to write. Their letters, if they tried, never arrived. This was Henry's master stroke of cruelty. He didn't just imprison her body, he severed her from everyone she loved. A woman who'd spent her life at the centre of vast networks of loyalty and correspondence, now sat in silence, with only the changing seasons outside her window to mark the passage of time. But Henry had miscalculated. He'd forgotten that before she was his queen, before she was Louis's queen, before she was anything else, Eleanor was the granddaughter of William IX, the first troubadour. She'd been raised in a world where memory was art, where stories and songs could travel faster than armies, where a whispered verse could topple kingdoms. You could lock up a woman, but you couldn't lock up an idea. In the silence of her prison, Eleanor's mind became her court. She'd close her eyes and she was back in Poitiers, the great hall alive with music and poetry. She could hear Bernard de Ventadour's voice, sweet as honey, singing of love that conquered all obstacles. She could smell the roses in her private garden, feel the southern sun on her face, taste the wine that flowed like water at her legendary feasts, the court of love, that half-mythical assembly where she and her daughter Marie were said to have judged romantic disputes, lived on in her memory. Whether it ever existed in the formal sense hardly mattered now. What mattered was what it represented. A world where women's voices carried weight, where power flowed through culture as much as conquest, where she had been not just a queen, but a creator of civilization itself. She remembered the questions they'd debated, half serious, half playful. Can true love exist within marriage? Does love grow stronger through absence or presence? Is it better to love without hope or never to love at all? In her prison, these weren't abstract philosophical questions anymore. They were the reality of her days. The stories from those years became legend, growing in the telling. Andreas Capellanus would later write his De Amor, claiming to record the judgments of Eleanor's court, turning her into a figure of romance and mystery. The truth was both simpler and more complex. She hadn't needed formal courts to shape the culture of an age. She'd done it through patronage and presence, through the force of her personality and the power of her position. Now, stripped of everything but memory, she became even more powerful as a symbol than she'd been as a woman. Henry thought he was erasing her. Instead, he was creating a myth. Every month she remained imprisoned. Her legend grew. In Aquitaine, troubadours sang of their lost Duchess in coded verses the king's men couldn't quite prove were treasonous. Young knights wore her colours in tournaments, claiming they honoured the institution of queenship, not any particular queen. Her name became a rallying cry whispered in corners, a promise that tyranny, even a king's tyranny, couldn't last forever. The irony was exquisite. By removing Eleanor from public view, Henry had transformed her into something more dangerous than a political opponent. She'd become an ideal, a symbol of resistance, a martyr to male tyranny. The queen who'd once had to fight for every scrap of power was now powerful simply by existing, by enduring, by refusing to conveniently die. And she wasn't entirely cut off from the world, no matter how carefully Henry tried to isolate her. Information has a way of seeping through even the thickest walls. A guard's carelessly dropped comment about troubles in Normandy, a serving woman's gossip about the king's health, a priest's prayer that mentioned her sons' names in ways that told her they lived, they fought, they remembered. She learned to read between the lines of what wasn't said. When her expensive French wine was replaced with English ale, she knew Henry's treasury was strained. When her guard doubled, she knew one of her sons had rebelled again. When they moved her suddenly in the middle of the night, she knew someone had been asking too many questions about the Queen's whereabouts. The historical record is tellingly silent about any letters from this period. No correspondence survives with her signature. No secret messages intercepted by Henry's efficient spy network. This absence is itself the most eloquent testimony to her complete isolation. The woman who'd once conducted diplomacy with emperors and popes couldn't even send birthday wishes to her children. But silence can be its own form of communication. Her very existence was a message Henry couldn't intercept or prevent. As long as she lived, she was proof that the king feared her, that he'd had to cage her because he couldn't control her any other way. Every year of her imprisonment was another year of Henry's admission that Eleanor of Aquitaine was too dangerous to be free. Her sons understood this message perfectly. Young Henry might be dead. That news had somehow reached her, carried on the wind of servants' whispers. But Richard lived. Richard ruled in Aquitaine with her memory as his guide. When he was harsh, men said he had his father's temper. But when he showed mercy, when he patronized poets, when he spoke of justice and law, they said he had his mother's wisdom. The common people, those who suffered under heavy taxes and endless wars, began to construct a different narrative. If the Queen had been free, they whispered, there would be peace. If Eleanor sat beside Henry, she would temper his cruelty. Her imprisonment became the explanation for every hardship, every injustice. She was transformed from a rebel who tried to tear the kingdom apart into the absent mother who could have held it together. Even her jailers, chosen for their loyalty to Henry, couldn't help but be affected by their prisoner. She was unfailingly courteous, never complaining, never begging. She thanked them for small kindnesses with the grace of a woman distributing honours at court. She inquired about their families with what seemed like genuine interest. She was in every way a perfect lady, which made her imprisonment seem all the more unjust. One guard, according to later legend, was asked what the Queen did all day. "She remembers," he replied. It was truer than he knew. In the absence of present power, Eleanor was constructing something more lasting than any political alliance. She was building a legend that would outlive them all. The years passed like water dripping on stone, slowly, but with inevitable effect. 1174 became 1175. Young Henry died in 1183, rebellion on his lips. 1185 saw more unrest in Richard's lands. 1187 brought news that shook even her isolation. Jerusalem had fallen to Saladin. The Crusader kingdom, that blood-soaked dream she'd once helped build, was crumbling. Through it all, Eleanor waited, not passively, but with the active patience of a chess player thinking 20 moves ahead. She couldn't see the board clearly from her prison, but she knew the pieces were still moving. Henry was aging. She could calculate that without seeing him. Her sons were growing more powerful, more restless. The empire was straining at its seams. Time, that luxury she'd once spent so freely, had become her weapon. Every day Henry kept her imprisoned was a day closer to his death. Every year that passed was a year her legend grew and his cruelties multiplied. She had nothing but time, and she would outlast him with it. The patient web she wove wasn't made of secret letters or hidden alliances. It was made of memory and myth, of whispered stories and growing legend. She couldn't orchestrate rebellion from her tower, but she didn't need to. Her very existence was rebellion enough. By surviving, by enduring, by refusing to break or beg or conveniently die, she was winning a war Henry didn't even realize he was fighting. Patience. It was the one virtue no one had ever accused Eleanor of Aquitaine of possessing. But 16 years of stone and silence had taught her its value. Revenge, she was learning. It wasn't a dish best served cold. It was best served by outliving your enemies and dancing on their graves. And Eleanor, despite everything, still knew how to dance. The news of Henry II's death reached Eleanor on a July morning in 1189, carried by a messenger who couldn't quite hide the tremor in his voice. The king was dead at Chinon, he told her. That same castle where her imprisonment had begun 16 years ago. He died defeated, betrayed by his favourite son John, abandoned by his barons, cursing God and his children with his last breath. Eleanor received the news with perfect stillness. No tears of grief for the husband who'd caged her. No cries of joy for the freedom that his death promised. Just a slight nod, as if confirming something she'd long expected. She'd outlasted him. The man who'd thought to erase her had been erased himself, while she remained, weathered by imprisonment but unbroken. What happened next became the stuff of legend. William Marshal, that paragon of knighthood, rode hard from France with orders from the new king to free his mother. He arrived at her prison expecting to conduct a formal liberation, reading royal writs, accepting the surrender of keys, all the ceremony that marked the transfer of a valuable prisoner. Instead, he found the guards already packing their belongings, and Eleanor calmly issuing orders as if she'd never stopped ruling. She hadn't waited for official permission to reclaim her freedom. The moment she'd heard of Henry's death, she'd simply informed her captors that their services were no longer required, and they'd obeyed. After 16 years, the force of her personality remained strong enough to command immediate submission. At 67, an age when most noble women had long since retired to convents or comfortable irrelevance, Eleanor burst back onto the political stage with the energy of someone half her age. There was no time for rest, no moment for savouring freedom. Richard was in France, securing his continental lands. England needed governing, and Eleanor would govern it. She embarked on a royal progress that would have exhausted a woman decades younger. From castle to castle, town to town, she rode with a speed that left her escort gasping. At each stop, the routine was the same. Summon the local lords, receive their oaths of loyalty to King Richard, settle disputes, dispense justice. She wasn't acting as a mother holding the throne for her son. She was ruling as what she'd always been, a sovereign in her own right. The pipe rolls from 1189 tell the story in their dry administrative language. By order of Queen Eleanor appears again and again. She commanded castles to be fortified. She appointed new sheriffs. She overhauled the tax system. Most brilliantly, she ordered a general release of prisoners from Henry's jails, declaring that having been a prisoner herself, she understood their plight. This wasn't mere sentiment, it was political genius. In one stroke, she'd flooded the kingdom with men grateful for her mercy, men who owed their freedom to the new regime, men who had their own grievances against Henry's harsh rule. Every released prisoner became a voice praising Eleanor's compassion, and by extension, Richard's legitimacy. When John, that perpetual schemer, tried to take advantage of Richard's absence to seize power, he found his mother waiting for him. Not the aged, broken woman he might have expected after 16 years of imprisonment, but Eleanor the politician, Eleanor the strategist, Eleanor the queen. She blocked his every move with a combination of maternal disappointment and iron authority. The boy who'd grown up barely knowing his mother discovered she knew him all too well. The chroniclers of the time struggled to hide their amazement. Here was a woman who should have been destroyed by her long captivity, who should have emerged broken and bitter. Instead, she ruled with a clarity and energy that put younger monarchs to shame. It was as if those 16 years of enforced contemplation had only sharpened her political instincts, distilled her wisdom to its purest form. When Richard finally arrived in England for his coronation, he found a kingdom at peace, its succession secure, its administration running smoothly. His mother had given him the greatest gift a new king could receive, a stable realm. At the coronation itself, Eleanor stood beside her son, and those who'd remembered her from before her imprisonment swore she looked not diminished but refined, like silver tested in fire. But Eleanor's true finest hour was yet to come, when Richard left on the Third Crusade, because of course he did. The fool could never resist a holy war. Eleanor once again took the reins of government, this time not for weeks but for years, as Richard chased glory in the Holy Land and found captivity instead. The news that Richard had been taken prisoner on his way home, sold like a piece of merchandise to the Holy Roman Emperor, might have broken a lesser woman. Eleanor's favourite son, the child for whom she had sacrificed everything, was now experiencing his own captivity. The Emperor demanded a ransom of 150,000 marks, a sum so vast it defied comprehension, equivalent to twice the annual revenue of the English crown. Eleanor's response was magnificent. At 70 years old, she threw herself into the monumental task of raising the ransom with an energy that amazed even her supporters. She squeezed the kingdom until it bled gold and silver, imposed crushing taxes that only she could have demanded without causing rebellion, and wrote letters to Pope Celestine III that burned with maternal fury and political genius. "I have lost the staff of my old age and the light of my eyes," she wrote, weaponizing her grief to shame the Pope into action. When the ransom was finally collected, Eleanor didn't entrust it to anyone else. At 72, in the depth of winter, She personally escorted the treasure across the Channel and through hostile territory to Germany. She negotiated directly with Emperor Henry VI like the sovereign she was, and when he tried to raise the price at the last minute, she simply stared him down and reminded him that the eyes of Christendom were watching. Richard was released in February 1194. The reunion between mother and son was, by all accounts, overwhelming. They travelled back to England together, and the crowds that greeted them couldn't tell who they were celebrating more, the freed king or the indomitable queen who'd freed him. But Eleanor's greatest triumph was still to come, when Richard died in 1199, shot by a crossbow while besieging a minor castle, because he could never resist a pointless fight. Eleanor was 77 years old. Most women would have finally retreated into well-earned retirement. Eleanor looked at the succession crisis brewing between John and her grandson Arthur of Brittany, and decided she had one more great act in her. The marriage alliance between France and England needed to be sealed with a wedding. Louis VII's heir needed a bride from Eleanor's line. At nearly 80 years old, Eleanor announced she would personally travel to Castile to fetch her granddaughter for the French throne. Her counsellors were aghast. The journey meant crossing the Pyrenees in winter, those murderous mountains that had broken younger travellers. It was madness. Eleanor set out anyway. The journey was everything her advisors had feared. Winter storms turned the mountain passes into death traps. The cold was so bitter it could kill a horse in hours. Avalanches had buried the regular routes. Bandits, knowing that royal trains carried royal treasures, haunted every blind turn. For a woman of Eleanor's age, travelling in a litter because she could no longer spend days in the saddle, it should have been impossible. But Eleanor of Aquitaine had made a career of doing the impossible. She pressed on through blizzards that forced even her guards to seek shelter. When passes were blocked, she found local guides who knew paths that didn't appear on any map. When bandits were reported ahead, she simply increased her guard and dared them to attack a queen. She reached the Castilian court like something out of legend. This ancient queen who'd conquered mountains that would have defeated an army. When presented with her two granddaughters, Ulrica and Blanche, she studied them with those eyes that had seen 3 kingdoms rise and fall. She chose Blanche, not because she was the prettier or the elder, but because she saw in the girl's bearing something of her own steel. The journey back was, if anything, worse. Winter had fully settled into the mountains, and now Eleanor had a 12-year-old girl to protect as well as herself. But she brought Blanche safely through the passes, delivered her to the altar, and lived to see her granddaughter become Queen of France. The same throne Eleanor had once occupied a lifetime ago. It was her last great act of state, but what an act it was. At an age when most people couldn't walk across a room without help, Eleanor had crossed the deadliest mountains in Europe in the deadliest season. Not once, but twice. She'd done it not for power or glory. She had nothing left to prove. But because it needed doing and she was Eleanor of Aquitaine, she did not yield to mountains any more than she'd yielded to kings. She retired at last to Fontevraud Abbey, that magnificent retreat where royal women went to find peace. But even in retirement, she remained formidable. John, now king, found himself constantly seeking her counsel when his barons rebelled, because of course they did. John had all of his father's vices and none of his virtues. It was Eleanor who negotiated truces when the French threatened. It was Eleanor who reminded them that she still held Aquitaine and would decide its fate. She'd outlived 2 husbands, 8 of her 10 children, and more enemies than she could count. She'd seen the rise and fall of kingdoms, the birth and death of dynasties. She'd been queen of 2 countries, Duchess in her own right, mother of kings, grandmother of queens. She'd known the heights of power and the depths of imprisonment, and she'd survived both with her dignity intact. The greatest revenge against Henry wasn't that she'd outlived him, though that was sweet enough. It wasn't that she'd ruled after him or saved the son he'd tried to disinherit. It was that she'd proved, beyond any doubt, that stone walls and iron locks couldn't cage a mind that refused to be bound. He'd tried to erase her from history. Instead, he'd guaranteed she'd be remembered forever. When death finally came for Eleanor in 1204, she was 82 years old. Ancient by medieval standards, having outlived her imprisonment by 15 years. She'd spent those years not in bitter reflection on what had been taken from her, but in seizing every opportunity that freedom offered. She'd ruled kingdoms, ransomed kings, crossed mountains, and shaped the fate of Europe. Henry had given her 16 years of winter. She'd given herself 15 years of spring. In the end, that was her greatest victory. Not that she'd endured the cage, but that she'd soared the moment the door opened. In the end, Henry II's greatest failure wasn't that he'd lost a civil war to his wife and sons. It wasn't that his empire crumbled after his death, or that his legacy was one of conflict rather than consolidation. His greatest failure was in fundamentally misunderstanding the nature of power itself. He'd thought power was something you could lock away, something you could contain within stone walls and silence. He'd believed that by imprisoning Eleanor's body, he could imprison her influence, her intellect, her indomitable will. For 16 years, he'd kept the most brilliant political mind of the age in a series of towers, moving her like a dangerous chess piece he was afraid to play but couldn't bear to lose. What he'd actually done was create a legend. Every year Eleanor spent in captivity was another layer added to her myth. The queen who'd been too dangerous to be free. The woman who'd threatened a king simply by existing. The mother whose love for her children was so powerful it had been declared treason. In trying to erase her, Henry had instead written her name in letters too large for history to ignore. And what of Eleanor herself? Those 16 years of imprisonment could have destroyed her. The isolation, the silence, the cruel separation from everything and everyone she loved. It was designed to break a human spirit, to reduce a queen to a shadow. Lesser people would have emerged from such an ordeal broken, bitter, or mad. Eleanor emerged like a blade that had been tempered in fire, stronger and sharper than before. She'd learned the most valuable lesson any ruler can learn. That true power doesn't come from armies or treasures or even kingdoms. It comes from the ability to endure, to outlast, to maintain your sense of self when everything else has been stripped away. In those long years of imprisonment, she'd discovered that they could take her freedom, her children, her lands, her very voice, but they couldn't take her mind, her will, her essential Eleanorness. The years after her release proved this beyond doubt. She didn't spend them in quiet retirement, nursing old grievances and mourning lost time. She exploded back into political life with a vigour that stunned everyone who encountered her. At an age when most people were preparing for death, she was crossing mountains in winter, at a time when she could have rested on her reputation. She was building new alliances, fighting new battles, shaping the future of Europe. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Eleanor's story is what she didn't do. She didn't seek personal revenge on Henry's supporters. She didn't use her freedom to settle old scores or pursue vendettas. She didn't even speak publicly about her imprisonment, those 16 stolen years. Instead, she focused on the future, on securing successions, building alliances, ensuring that the Angevin legacy would endure. Henry had spent 16 years fearing what Eleanor would do if she ever got free. What he hadn't imagined was that she would simply govern, that she would take back her power as naturally as breathing, and use it not for destruction, but for construction. Today, Eleanor lies at Fontevraud beside Henry, an irony she probably would have appreciated. In death, they share the space they couldn't share in life. His effigy shows a king in repose, hands folded in eternal prayer. Hers shows her reading a book, even in stone. She's absorbed in learning, in thinking, in the life of the mind that no prison could ever chain. Eleanor of Aquitaine spent 16 years in prison. She spent 15 years after that proving that those 16 years had been nothing more than an interlude, a pause in a life too large to be contained by any cage. She'd entered her imprisonment as a rebel queen. She'd emerged as something more, a symbol of endurance, a testament to the power of patience, a reminder that some spirits are simply too vast to be confined. In the end, that's the lesson Eleanor leaves us, echoing across 8 centuries like the sound of a key turning. Not to lock a door, but to open it. They can imprison your body. They can steal your years. They can separate you from everything you love. But if your spirit remains unbroken, if your mind remains your own, if you can endure with dignity and emerge with purpose, then no cage can truly hold you. Eleanor didn't just survive 16 years of imprisonment. She transcended them, and in doing so, she transformed herself from a medieval queen into an eternal inspiration. The Lioness had been caged, but when the door finally opened, she remembered how to roar, and that roar echoes still, reminding anyone who's ever felt trapped of Eleanor's greatest truth. Some chains, once broken, become wings.